Thank you to our last panel. That was amazing. All right, we have one more panel to go, guys. This one is actually a fireside chat, so talking about cyber terrorism. I'd like to welcome Amit Meltzer, a technology strategist and evangelist. We'll let him come out on his own time. Michael Stoddart, the lead of Provincial Anti-Terrorism Section for OPP.
I'm happy.
Ray Boisvert, partner at IBM Canada. Bob Gordon, an executive director at Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. And Farouk Nair, the CISO of Orion. Welcome, panel.
Okay, see you. Sounds good. Thanks, Amber.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Amber. I'm sure everybody would have been sick and tired of seeing me, so I promise you this is the last time you guys are seeing me on the stage. So, by the looks of it, this was supposed to be a fireside chat. But the topic was so interesting that this has now transformed into an interesting panel. So we have representation from Ontario Provincial Police. We have Ray Boisvert, who has worked many years in CISO, so has Bob Gordon, and Amit brings an international perspective. So this is now transformed into a fireside chat / a panel discussion. So cyber terrorism. It's the big elephant in the room, right? Nobody talks about it, but it does affect us in many ways. So let's kick off this discussion by starting this discussion by actually asking the question that, is cyber terrorism real? Okay, so I'll throw that question to Ray and hear your perspective on that. What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, thanks, Farouk. It's a challenging one, and I think it's one it's a threat that's either real or imagined. If it's real, it certainly hasn't been consequential yet to date, but it could be at some point. I guess if you did a survey, if you walked down the street just in front of the hotel and asked a number of people very randomly, do you believe that cybersecurity and cyber terrorism are eventually going to collide in something where we have a situation where something significant, critical infrastructure or something similar could be threatened or attacked. And I suspect if anybody who's absorbed much pop culture in the last number of years ago, oh, absolutely. I mean, half the movie plots and TV shows and have something to do with some sort of cyber takeover and people held hostage and infrastructure destroyed. I guess I'm a little more challenged around it. I'm a practitioner. I've been almost 35 years around policing and national security. It's been talked about a lot. It's been thought about a lot. It's been prepared for to a considerable degree. I do ascribe to the idea that eventually something bad will happen. It'll involve the pathways of cyber networks and digital networks to be able to target and survey and to do the right kind of preparatory work to a successful attack. I think if you look at the pages in the playbook at a 9/11 where you take an advanced society's technology and you ram it down their throat, I don't think we'll see aircraft used again in that way because we've hardened those targets, but I think we'll probably see other type of technology, so therefore you have to think in a digital dependent world, it would be that. I can't dismiss the fact that Daesh, as an international organization that's now in deep retreat, it had attracted a lot of very talented people, a lot of very young talented people who would be very, very good at this. So you would have to think it's not hard for them to move from propaganda and recruitment to a place where they would consider sort of attacks. But I'll finish off with this thought, though. Despite all that, I mean, certainly as it's a credible threat, I would not panic yet, but I would also not be complacent. I think we have a hard definitional problem with it, though, as well, even from a national security perspective. Cyber security is somewhat defined. Cyber threats around cyber terrorism is not. We have actually quite traditional definitions of threats. If you look at the CISO Act, which is the quintessential definition set for national security enforcement actions, the actual 2C definition around terrorism doesn't fit cyber terrorism. We're probably better off going with Section 2A, sort of dealing with espionage and sabotage. So cyber would be the pathway, but it does require an essential element. So if we targeted, let's say, I don't know, power generation plant just down the river here, and we took it, there was a cryptoware, a ransomware thing happened. And so we're not sure who is demanding the ransom, but we know it's affected critical infrastructure. Is that some form of cyber terrorism? Well, the motive is very, very important, not just from a pure legal perspective, but it's important. It's the idea that ultimately, under the Canadian legislation dealing with national security, you have to demonstrate that it's for political, religious, or ideological reasons, and has to involve acts of serious violence. So that kind of runs up a little short. So I guess we do have some definitional problems. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, it's something that we have to turn our minds to, and hence a great topic for today's panel.
Thank you, Ray. So taking the discussion forward, when we talk about terrorism or cyber terrorism or threat actors, we talk about the role of state and non-state actors. So, Amit, what do you take? What's your take on that? On the role of state and non-state actors?
Sure. State actors have two different modes of activity. Has been at the same pretty much level for 15 years or even more. They actively pursue intelligence gathering and theft of secrets of any kind, causing almost no damage. On the other hand, they continue developing and testing in limited scenarios tools that are part of cyber warfare, that are aimed at widespread disruption, support for conventional warfare, and now evolution to attacking weapon systems. So there's a huge difference between what state actors are doing now and what they will do if there's an open conflict. And you can't really judge by what they're doing now what they will do in that case, because it will probably be a sort of methodical usage of cyber warfare tools to disrupt as part of their war game plan. One of the aspects of cyber weapons, different from conventional weapons, is that many of them are like a match. You use it once, it's exposed, and it's done. Not necessarily done altogether, because people react slowly, but most of the effect is the effect of the first time. That's why a lot of these tools are kept on the shelf. You can see the arsenal of cyber warfare tools that the Russians have. They used a couple of them during the civil war in the eastern Ukraine several years ago, after they annexed the Crimean Peninsula. And they took out most of the Ukrainian electricity grid. They only used two tools. And those tools have been sort of deactivated because everyone studied them, so they are ineffective anymore. They are certain to have better tools that they don't show or don't even test unless it's in a sort of a controlled environment. Most of the activity that you see with state actors is intelligence through cyber means. Theft of information with targeted information that they need. It's either economic or commercial information or government and military secrets. And everyone is doing it. Most of the news is usually about Chinese and Russian attacks that steal such information, but the biggest actor in state attacks on cyberspace is the US. And the number of attacks on China and Russia is about a power of magnitude bigger than all the attacks that get published in the newspapers. You just don't have the same level of press because they usually don't report it, at least not at the same level. Non-state actors usually don't try to go for that level of malice that is sort of built into warfare capabilities. Even terrorists only go after a certain limited set of capabilities, and so far they've used almost none. So as insane as it sounds, most terrorist organizations are showing a form of restraint in using readily available exploit that can cause real-world incidents and even disasters. State actors have no interest in creating peacetime incidents, so they don't activate the tools. they are certain to activate it if there's any form of global conflict that will escalate above the sort of Cold War that we have now.
Thank you, Amit. Let's start talking about some use cases, recent scenarios, or recent events. Ray spoke about critical infrastructure. Quite recently, we have seen municipalities being a huge target for ransomware or breaches. We just heard about some municipalities in the state of Texas who were targeted. There were some municipalities in Ontario which were targeted also. So in terms of threats, the threats are evolving. They are becoming more advanced. So Bob, in your opinion, how are those threats becoming more advanced, and what's the motivation behind that?
Great question. When we started out this year, a lot of the predictions were that what's the big business risk for Canadian companies for going into 2019? And number 2 on that list became cybersecurity for the first time, or cyber risk. What was interesting is disruption of supply chain was number 1, which essentially a lot of that comes back down to a cyber. So the prediction coming into this year, number 1 and number 2 across Canadian industry was going to be cyber affected. And it didn't matter what industry you look at. Trucking, for example, the number 3 risk to the trucking industry in Canada is cybersecurity, according to the trucking industry themselves. So the test is, that was sort of January, December coming into this year. How has that played out? Almost in any measure you want to do, and there'll be arguments amongst the various researchers on what's the percentage, but all of them will agree the percentage has gone up exponentially. IBM did some great work from IBM X-Force saying that ransomware attacks had gone up 200% in the first part of this year going into, from what it had been last year. And one of the interesting things about ransomware is it makes every single one a target. Every single company now becomes a target. Up until a couple of years ago, if you didn't have anything of intellectual property, you didn't have any information people wanted to steal, you say, no, worry about the company over there, worry about IBM, they got all kinds of trade secrets. I'm a small company, I don't need anything. Ransomware has changed that dynamic completely, because what they want to do is deny you the access to the information or whatever it is that makes your company operate. And the effectiveness is not what an IT shop typically looks after. Well, I didn't lose any data this time or when this event occurred. It's shutting down your business. I was speaking with a small trucking company just outside Moncton that got hit with a $150,000 ransom. They've been down already for a week. They couldn't possibly pay that. They figure by the end of next week they're closing up shop. And that's hitting businesses all the time. The problem is there's very little reporting coming through on it. So ransomware attacks, I talked to our companies that belong to the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. We've got about 100 of them now. What's hitting them across the board are ransomware attacks coming through. And it's becoming more professional as they do it. Organized crime has moved into the ransomware world. They're starting to share information on attack techniques, tools, much faster than they've been doing before. That's really making it hard to go back and do attribution. Because one of the things you always want to know, well, who's coming after me? I might be able to do something about that. So they're now sharing the tools to make their attacks more effective, but that also tends to throw off those authorities that are trying to find out who's actually doing it. It makes it much harder to go through and try to do that. So it no longer matters if you're a small municipality, what do you do? And what was interesting, and when you talk about municipalities, one of the big attacks that occurred in the southern United States a couple of months ago, ransomware goes in, well, 2 things. A, they've been inside your system for a long time. So the notion that all of a sudden the ransomware or the attackers are going to come in, they're inside your system now, and 10 minutes later the attack is going to occur on your system. They've been inside your system for a long time. Average in Canada is about 171 days the attacker's been inside your system before they do something. So they really understand your network. They know how to actually go after it. Interesting, in the United States, when the attack occurred, shut down the city, shut down the police department, shut down the 911 system. Those are real operational impacts. What did the attacker do? They didn't go and talk to the city about paying the ransom. They immediately went to the insurance company to say, hey, look, we're now going to have a discussion about paying the ransom, because they know the city might not be able to pay it. The insurance company sure does, because they don't want to get stuck with the cost of having to rebuild that entire network. Boston spent $18 million trying to rebuild their system. The attackers are getting smarter. They're going after who's got the money, and in this case, they're going after the insurance companies. We can have a debate as to whether that's good business to be able to do that. Are you encouraging the ransomware more attacks to occur because they're getting money out of it? Interesting philosophical question. The second part of that that's occurring, and we've had examples in Canada, let's start from the understanding we are talking about criminals. Criminals. There is no such thing as honor amongst criminals, and you can't rely on them. So they will come in and they will say, well, we'll open your system back up if you pay this ransom. You should talk to the CEO of the Fort McMurray Airport Authority, who had a philosophical decision with their board of directors that they wouldn't pay ransom. They were down for just over 10 days. They then decided, well, we can't be down that much longer. We're going to pay it. They paid the ransomware, and guess what? These honorable criminals did not come through and did not reinstall or decrypt it. The other trend that we're seeing recently, and this is over the last few months, which is really worrisome, that there is no intention of actually bringing you back online. And part of that is what they're trying to do is ratchet up the fear factor. Or they'll not only do the ransom or the attack on the data, but they'll actually go through and put a wiper on your system to wipe out the software. What they're trying to do is put more pressure on you, up the ante. These aren't, and we're not talking in theory, this is going on, and you're seeing companies being hit all the time. We're now starting to see the reporting coming in actually from Stats Canada from a couple of years ago. We're now seeing a lot of Canadian companies coming through and admitting they're starting to get hit. Some of the legislation on the changes to the PIPEDA is going to force more of that to come through. So I think we'll start to get a better understanding of really how desperate things are getting out there.
A couple of comments, if I can. First of all, you have to realize that ransomware is at its peak now. It's about to go down. So they are actively trying to reap as much benefits as they can. The preventive measures are improving to a scale that they see that in about 2 or 3 years, the rate of, or the ease with which you can create a ransomware attack will vanish. And that's why they are upping the ante. And another thing that should concern you is that they are now doing concerted attacks. Yesterday, there was an attack that took out 23 townships in Texas at the same time. This is coordination that requires significant organizational skills and timing. So they are upping the ante, but also broadening the attack. Some attacks are more like a broadside now, because they see the end of this very lucrative business for criminals. Another thing that should concern you as security managers is that there's a reason they stay so long inside the networks. They are trying to figure out your DR plans and go after your backups and after your infrastructure configuration systems, because they want to derail your ability to quickly rebound back, not based on strong cyber controls, but on very good IT management and administration basics. So when you look for things to protect, look for creating a more comprehensive disaster recovery plan as part of cyber resiliency. It's not a separate issue. It's maybe your last level of defense when a ransomware attack hits.
Okay, thank you. So taking the discussion forward, so cyber terrorism is not just limited to ransomware or cyber or breaches. There's another important element to it: fifth generation warfare, propagation of online hate, propaganda, and all that. Lots going on, lots of fake news and all that. So, Michael, you're in law enforcement, so I just wanted to hear your perspective on how do you guys go about enforcing all that and
Sure.
going after that.
So first of all, thanks very much for having me. Incredible conference, incredible topic. As far as trends in Canada internationally, we're seeing definitely an increase in hate crime, hate speech, online, social media, everything that's coming. And it's dovetailing with international ideas where now we're having people coming out of small town Ontarios who normally would not be able to find commonality with other people. Now they're becoming friends online, and it's propagating itself exponentially across the world. I know Ray, in preparing for this, Ray asked me, Mike, what keeps you up at night? And I think that's an incredible question. And with the panel, my jaw's dropping with the cyber side of it, but I think it's also the pure aspect of the ability for people to be able to communicate across the world with like-minded interests, to be able to reinforce those beliefs and reinforce what their hate speech, what their and potentially put it into action. And from a law enforcement perspective, that's where we have a really difficult time, locally, nationally, internationally, is being able to, number one, disrupt, prevent, and monitor these things up, as an international issue. We're very, very good at the reaction of running to the fire and fighting the fire at the scene. It's extremely difficult for us, capacity-wise, expertise-wise, with these online chat groups and whatever, to be able to infiltrate and disrupt it prior to potential violence, right? And in Canada specifically, you're looking at 2 right-wing groups that have just been listed as terrorist entities in Canada. So Blood and Honor and Combat 18 this year are brand new right-wing terrorist entities. And we're seeing them slowly expand their reach online through that. I know it's not quite the same as the cyber attack, but it is all part of that big picture and some of our challenges as well.
Farouk, if I could just maybe build on that thought too, because I know I do want to definitely debunk the myths that are quite often present when people talk about cyber and terrorism. We have to be very careful about that, but at the end of the day, without sounding too academic, you got to come back to the foundation of what we're all gravitating towards is ultimately a crypto event or some sort of ransomware or a hate speech group or anything that leads towards this ability to affect others adversely, denying them access to their data, interfering with that accessibility to it, or maybe even modifying it, or simply creating fear, loss of business, so on. That creates terror. So I think the effect is there. So I think that's where we come to the intersection of those 2 words. And I think it's fair to do that. Bob mentioned the trucking logistics industry. Well, we've eaten quite well here today, and that's going to continue. Well, I'm not sure everybody understands the fragility of that supply chain. Supply chain that brings most of the food and petrol to our local gas stations and so on, about 48 hours in the pipeline, I think, at any given time. So a disruption of that, whether it's through just a criminal act, people are looking to lock something down, or it's a state or non-state actor, the effects will be the same. And so it's really down to this issue that Mike is pointing out is it's that hardening. And I think we can't rely on law enforcement. I mean, companies like IBM and others like ours, we certainly try to do our best to help companies get there. Bob at CCTX and, of course, Amit too and his firm. But at the end of the day, companies have to realize that they have to make themselves resilient, but through good partnerships with good firms, because there are a multiplicity of threat actors out there. There's a multitude of tools, and there are limitations on what we can expect from the state, from law enforcement to deal with it.
Yeah, good point. In fact, during lunch, I was having a conversation with some of my peers, and they brought up a really interesting point about biological warfare. And they were just saying that the entire US just has food supplies for 3 days. So what if the entire power grid goes down? That would affect other elements of the supply chain, like refrigeration, and people are at the risk of dying through cholera than through any other act of cyber attack or cyber incident. So it's like it can affect other pieces of the supply chain also.
And just to add to that,
Yeah.
the collateral damage or the potential of collateral damage, of stopping the trucking industry to get the on-time delivery of the food and the petrol and everything like that is the entire country can shut down based on, now we've got people that aren't eating and so on and so on and so on. So huge impact, potential impact. I agree with Ray. I don't think because of the good prevention and everything that we're doing, I don't mean we as in law enforcement, I mean the community at large. I think we're at risk, but I think we're also very lucky that we have the right things in place to be able to prevent a lot of this stuff as well.
And one of the things we've been talking about is, I'll call it doing something with data and the consequences of that. So far, we've been really fortunate in touch wood. The terrorist organization, in this case I talk about real terrorist organizations that do, we call kinetic attacks all the time. Typically the leader of a terrorist organization is interested in doing 2 things. One, they want it to be spectacular, so the gorier, the bloodier, the better, because the whole idea is to instill fear, terror amongst the population. They also have a cadre of people out there that are doing this for them. And so when they want to train them to go out and do something, and they want to make sure it's 100% successful. It's a little harder when they start to think about how can I use cyber to do a kinetic effect. And so far they haven't got there. What I worry about is, you all remember the pressure cooker bombers in Boston, 3-4 years ago now. The beauty of that as a terrorist organization, that was a really simple device, really simple to instill within their followers. Here's how you go and build the thing, and you know it's going to be successful, and you're going to get some kind of reward, whatever the reward is for the particular terrorist organization for doing that. What I worry about is what happens when terrorist organizations start to figure out that they can build the equivalent of the pressure cooker bomb, but do it electronically. And that's something to be worried about, because then you've got an adversary out there that's actually committed. They've got resources. At one time, there was a study done on the number of engineers in terrorist organizations. It was quite high. So they certainly have the capability. And so far, it's been all these other considerations within terrorist organizations that have held them back. I attended an interesting conference in Israel several years ago, where we actually sat down and spent the whole conference looking at the terrorist use of technology as part of their raison d'etre and how they're actually going to execute their attacks. So far, they're using it mainly for fundraising, propaganda, command and control of their operations. We want to worry about or think about, as cyber professionals, what happens when they want to make that switch over to start linking it up with something kinetic.
And I think the cross point on that too would be this issue of operational technology in the Internet of Things, or Internet of Operational Technology, and or industrial technologies would be this idea that ultimately it's the weaponization of, is it the boiler, is it the elevator, is it any kind of automated system that punches out metal, small devices or things or widgets that go into some other larger production. That's what worries me. We've already had one or a couple of incidents over the years where it was ThyssenKrupp in Germany, a boiler exploded. It was a malfunction, but it was also cyber related, not clear what the motives were. Then you've got the mother of all these ones, which would be a nuclear power facility. So we have the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Was it 2 summers ago, Bob? I think they went out with an advisory to all utilities to say that there is active reconnaissance taking place on your networks. Pay attention. We're talking about state actors, potentially others, and they have the ability, and if should they choose, that's the thing, once you're living, as Bob says, once you're living on somebody's network for over 150 days, you know it probably as well as the system in does. And if you do that, then the time is really just of your choosing as to when you want to do something malicious. And it might just be lockdown data, or it could be make something go boom.
What was interesting about that case you're talking about, Ray, in the United States, and it's something for CISOs to start thinking about when you look at, what's the extent of your responsibility. It doesn't end at your building, it's what's your supply chain. In that instance, the state attackers got in by hacking into an 18-person construction company in Oregon. They've been hired to come in and do some work in this nuclear facility, and that's how they hack back into the entire system. That's a real challenge for CISOs to start thinking differently about what's the extent of your responsibilities. You thought it was just all your employees walking out the door with laptops or their data on some kind of mobile device. Really different story when you've got to start thinking about, okay, who else is plugging into my network? I'm going down to speak with the building owners and operators system. So every one of their tenants logging into their building. So most of the buildings run now on about 70 different operating systems, all of which hook through the internet, and all their tenants now hook into that. So the security of keeping this hotel up is now all the tenants in this hotel that are plugging into that system. Really starts to change the dynamic of what's the extent of your vulnerability as a CISO.
You have to remember that terrorists, their main agenda is not just to kill people. Killing people is easy. What they are after is to erode trust and confidence in the democratic society. And to do that, they don't just need to explode a cyber attack and cause some damage. They want to reach out and recruit someone, radicalize him, and have him do it locally, because then they gain 2 advantages. A, they used cyber as part of an attack pattern. B, they showed they have the ability to reach out without ever physically meeting someone and radicalizing him over the internet. Now, radicalizing people over the internet, as was said, is one of the challenges of how to handle it, because the statistics of rehabilitating people who are radicalized to the level of participating over the net are very poor. Once someone gets to that level of radicalization, he's pretty much lost to open society. He'll always be a menace. So the proper way to go after cyber terrorism is to try to dismantle the recruiting and radicalization process. This is a state-level effort, or even a Western Hemisphere effort, because it requires an enormous amount of resources to flush out the sort of radicalization and recruiting processes, and then shut them down. But if you don't do that, then you will never be rid of that process of recruiting those lone wolves attackers that will still crop up every few days, weeks, or years. So if you really want to go to the root cause, you have to begin with education and shut down the online recruitment process. Otherwise, there will always be people who can be radicalized because of personal issues.
I'd like to come back to Michael. I think when we were planning for this discussion, we had a discussion about the role of individual lone actors who are feeding off of somebody else's agenda. So,
Okay,
like
so
expand
I
on that?
spoke very briefly about it, just the internet and the world is so small. If you take a like-minded person, has the ability to communicate, to be able to get to their goals and means. One of the things that causes me concern is a lone actor that we call, well, something will happen somewhere in New York City or Chicago or across the world, and the social media and the media is picking up on that, a New Zealand attack or whatever, and there's like-minded, similar people, never spoken to each other, never had any communication whatsoever, but they feel that cause and or whatever final message has been left, or God forbid worse, the Facebook live showing of this attack somewhere else spurns them on to do something locally within Canada or near themselves. We've had a couple in Canada that we can speak of, and it very similar to the tools of a terrorist attack. A single mind or a person with an ideological issue which fits within Ray's definition of terrorism. It hasn't been prosecuted yet because it's a homicide case in Toronto, and I won't give you the details just because it's still ongoing through court. But having said that, those are real issues that are tangible to us. Some of the challenges that we have in law enforcement are whether companies don't want to report being victims of a cyber attack because of their loss of business or loss of credibility or whatever reason, and we call it it's a spillage or a loss or whatever, and we'll never find out about it. But probably our biggest challenge, though, is identification and bringing somebody through a court process through the cyber world, because law enforcement doesn't necessarily, we have experts, but we don't have the capacity to do all these criminal investigations, whether it's mischief to data and like that, because we have Crown attorneys that we have a small group that are experts, but the day-to-day people not really comfortable in this world. You've got the cloud issues, you've got judges that don't necessarily understand it. So to start to finish, the challenge of a successful prosecution once an attack has happened, the identification of the person or a group, and then bringing them into custody and the chain is extremely difficult in our world, which is just the reality of. So I guess from my perspective and out to you is prevention and disruption in your worlds is probably, the best fight against these types of attacks. Yeah, no different than your own house. You're target hardening your own house, and you have lights, and you have locked doors and front and back, and alarm systems and whatever. No different with your companies. It's just that basic, right?
Yeah, I guess it's one of those dilemmas that all Western societies face that observe the rule of law. We're up against adversaries who follow no rules, and have all the capability and have the advantage of the attacker of deciding when and where, and they can just keep on trying and keep on doing reconnaissance and surveying. So, Mike's right on. At the end of the day, they're at a deep disadvantage because of the observance of the rule of law and the processes, especially in a charter-based environment like Canada, where the rules of engagement around prosecution are so high. So it really behooves the CISO audience at the end of the day, irrespective of who the source of the threat is, in terms of what target group it is, and whatever the motive may be, criminal or otherwise. At the end of the day, it's still basically the 101 of cyber defense. It's that ability to have full visibility on your network and having some of the best technology and the best sort of investments. It is all around the awareness piece, around the training, all the softer skills and things that go on. Certainly is around the idea that we're going to have to keep on amping up our ability to inject that artificial intelligence and all those ways to automate and machine learn and to increase and amplify and force multiply the work we do. But mostly, though, it's how we respond and having those playbooks, that orchestration. Automated orchestration, absolutely, where possible. Otherwise, recognize something bad's going to happen, and something really bad in the sense that it could have larger societal implications. And that's why this title of this thing's around the terrorism effects of the loss of critical systems that many of you here are responsible for. That's a big impact.
Okay, thanks. So, moving the discussion towards actual scenarios or actual events which have taken place. Prior to coming to this discussion, we were just having a pre-discussion, and Amit made a really interesting point, and touchwood, so far, Canada itself doesn't have so many use cases around cyber terrorism. But since Amit comes with an international perspective, he was sharing some examples of events, and I think and the reason why I want to bring up the discussion is that we should all learn from those things and all that. So, Amit, in terms of some possible scenarios and use cases,
before I describe some scenarios, this is not a discussion to try to frighten you. I'll give you one good piece of advice how to, each in your domain, try to figure out where are the potential attack surfaces. The way a significant event is being built is usually beginning with use cases of the worst accidents and malfunction that happen in the same factor. So when I, for example, I look at profiling a cyber attack that will be debilitating to power supply or to water supply, I go to a couple of companies. I'm not sure if there are any CISOs here who come from the critical infrastructure or utilities. I go to those companies and I look at their accident and maintenance record to see what's the worst that they had for natural causes, and like malfunction or human error, and what was the extent of the damage. Because a terrorist will do the same. He will look at your track record and try to figure out how to cause the maximum damage, and then he'll try to figure out how to recreate that same accident or event using cyber. And 4 out of 5 times he won't find the part. The 5th time he will. So examples, and terrorists also are subcontracting a lot of their research and development to professional criminals, whose level of willingness to subcontract work from terrorists is now almost eroded. So a couple of examples, water utility companies, a couple of them were breached in the past 2 years. They were breached through the mechanical infrastructure, the maintenance of the SCADA systems that control the water supply, and then the attackers, which were criminals, moved on into the payment server and hacked the PII data of the entire community that was paying to that water utility. But along the way, they took a good look at the SCADA system, and they played with the controls, and based on the footprint that they left, they figured out how to manipulate the level of chemicals that are infused into the water, including fluoride and chlorine. In a sense, they created a blueprint for a terror attack that will go run the same process, but use a different payload. Raise the level of fluoride and chlorine to a level that poses danger by consumption, and then let the system go. Of course, it will not take a long time until the administrators realize what is happening and manually shut down the water supply, but the ripple effect of tampering with drinking water will cause widespread fear and worse, failure of trust or lack of trust in the systems simply because it could happen. People will lose confidence that they can drink water from the tap without dying or getting very sick. More sinister attacks have to do with what you are used to think of as the sort of the core assets of your company. These are the data sets. Now, data sets they service a business process. And usually the business process has a lot of trust with the data that it works in because there's a sort of implicit trust model within every organization. If you can reach the data, instead of encrypting him and asking for ransom, if you are a terrorist, you will try to tamper with it in a way that will create havoc. One example, there were about 200 hospitals that were breached in the last year. Instead of encrypting their files, go to the files of critical treatment procedures like chemotherapy and medicine for heart ailment, etc., and change the dosages or replace some factors. So people will get sicker when they get the same factor, because if a doctor is not ultra diligent, he will not question what is in the electronic file that is actually the treatment course for a serious disease. So it will be found after a while, but it will crush the public confidence in getting the best treatment possible from a medical establishment simply because a cyber hacker could twist the data so much that people died from the treatment. The same can be said for a financial institute. It's almost impossible to cause a bank to go bankrupt, at least as long as the Commissioner of Banking supports it. But it's very easy to disrupt a bank for weeks and months and really cause a widespread disruption without ransomware. What you need to do is figure out how to cause maximum disturbance or disruption of the data that will mandate the bank to go back to manual verification. This happened from natural causes, human error, in Ireland 2 years ago, an affiliate of the Royal Bank of Scotland. It took them 6 weeks to get their general ledger back online. During that 6 weeks, there were no banking services. This is as close to a catastrophe as you can think of when you think about the Joe Public and the type of services he's used to get from a financial institute. The same can apply for almost any type of organization. Look for the scenarios that in the past caused the maximum disruption or even led into an accident, and then these are what are usually referred to in risk assessment as high frequency, high impact, low frequency events. The outcome of such an event is maximum damage, but the chances of it happening are very low. Risk managers in IT tend to disregard these scenarios as being of very low probability of happening. Terrorists will go after those scenarios knowing that the security controls cyber is putting in organizations are not configured to detect or negate those improbable scenarios. So look after them and try to figure out how to deny a cyber terrorist the option to recreate something that really hurt your organization or your industry, because this is how they do their homework. They go after the records of outage and accidents, and then they try to recreate them using cyber tools.
Thank you. So since we are short on time, just one last thing which I wanted to bring up was that in terms of legislation, what is being done in Canada right now and what could be done better? So Bob, what's your take on that?
How many of you have read Bill C-51 that came out about 4 years ago, or Bill C-59? I see one hand up here. So would somebody please go over and help that gentleman? We need to get you some counseling, because it's really dry stuff. The summary of those two pieces of legislation runs to about 70 pages. And I'm not going to go through the 70-page summary for you. But I think the last piece of legislation the government brought out is probably the most notable. And one of the things in there was actually created as a standalone piece of legislation, the Communication Security Establishment. So they'd actually been established as a separate act rather than being buried into the National Defense Act. And there's a couple of interesting things that are in there that are relevant to some of the things we've been talking about today. And let me just highlight a couple of them. One is that they've now given CSE the authority, legal authority, to proactively collect foreign intelligence as it relates to defending networks in Canada. And in the past, they couldn't do that. That didn't fit within the national priorities as they were identified in law. So that means that CSE can now use its foreign espionage, electronic espionage capability to actually gather some information on what the attackers are doing back into Canada. That becomes important because CSE now has embedded within its legislation the ability to go after and actually do something about those attackers coming in. So that they can now proactively go out and try where they can. All kind of caveats around how they do it and all the rest, but at least they now have the legal authority to go out and start to do that. That's probably the single biggest thing that the government's done. There's a lot of information they've talked about, and Ray and I have talked about this. They brought in some legislation to actually make it easier for the government to share information amongst themselves. It was a great piece of legislation in C-51. They now, and when C-59 came out, they now said, maybe we'll twist some of that off. So government can still start to share information amongst themselves a little better. But the other thing about the CSE legislation is they now have the ability to go out to assist systems that are identified as being of critical importance to the government. So that's not everybody. That will literally be a small handful within the critical infrastructure area that they're going to be able to go out and actually assist in protecting those networks. They're looking at organizations such as mine to actually go out and deal with everybody else to pass that along. But that's a real significant change that the government actually did. They provided some funding out of that. They created the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity as a subset of CSE to actually do more of that private sector engagement. They're moving into a brand new building. And the really interesting, it's at a psychological change for them because they're going from a completely top secret environment. They're now moving into an environment that's completely open, and they're going to be able to invite the private sector in. So all the discussions about private sector having to have security clearances to go in there are all going to be gone. They're going to be, other than that one tiny little room in there, the whole building is going to be open and really open for business in terms of collaborating with the private sector in a way that they've never been able to legally do in the past. So that's a big change. It's funded to be able to go on through it and actually do that. What else could they do? I mean, one of the simple things, disruption would be better. So the more the government actually gets on and starts to do the disruption and getting out there and stop the attacks before they come in, because quite often a lot of the attacks, there's not commercial software out there that's going to be able to help you with that. So the more CSE can be out there abroad trying to do that will be helpful. The other thing that would be good for the government to do is come through and do something we call safe harbor legislations. That basically would say any information you're sharing with anyone else, you're doing it in good faith to try to protect their system, that will not be used against you. And trying to get the government to do that will be a helpful thing. I'm negotiating with one government department now to actually come through and give us something in writing that they'll actually agree to that. But having it at a broader policy statement would actually enable a lot of the cooperation I know that you want to be doing, even amongst yourselves, would make that a lot more legally palatable when you're sitting down and talking to your legal department. And that will be a fairly simple win. Hopefully, whichever is the new government coming in, they'll grab onto that.
And I guess the issue du jour, it's one where it's a great way to finish off a panel because we could spend a whole panel discussion on it, is the issue of backdoors and encryption.
Oh, exactly.
How do you allow law enforcement to do its job, to be disruptive and maybe bring people to justice, at the same time where we're so wedded with the idea that ultimately what's mine, it's my data, keep your hands off it. So it's a tough one, and probably no Western government wants to broach except for the U.S.
Oh, exactly. And cyber terrorism itself is such a vast and diverse topic. I wish we had more time for this, but we are out of time now. But thanks a lot, Amit, Bob, Ray, and Michael, for your insights. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody.